Salutations, everyone, and welcome to this session on the Australian National PID Strategy and Roadmap information session. My name is Melra Almeida, and I lead the Australian ORCID Consortium here with the AAF. Along with me today presenting in this session will be Matthias Luffers, who's the Product Manager for PID Services at the Australian Research Data Commons, and Siobhan McCafferty, who is the Project Manager for PIDs at the Australian Research Data Commons. Now, before we go ahead and get started, there's just a few housekeeping rules that we need to go through. For starters, this session is being recorded. What we are going to do is during our presentation, you may have questions. What I'd get you to do is if you could write them down in the Q&A box below, that would be great, because as soon as our presentation is over and we're ready for questions, we will be looking at the Q&A box in the first instance and going through questions that have arrived in order. Moving on, next slide, please. Before we start off, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we've come today to gather and share knowledge. In my case, I'm in Brisbane, and it's the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I would like to pay my respects to all their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Next slide, please. So, our agenda for today is what we'll do is, I'm sure most of you all already are familiar with what persistent identifiers are, but for the uninitiated, we'll go through what PIDs are. We'll look at what is ORCID, a bit about the Australian ORCID Consortium, and then finally we'll find out more about the Australian National PID Strategy and the roadmap, and how as consortium members we can contribute towards it. And then finally, we'll be taking question and answers. Next slide, please. Cool. So persistent identifiers, they are just the beginning, because they are everywhere. The policy papers you read, the grey literature, journal papers, books, even people, data sets, software, all of them have persistent identifiers assigned to them. But what exactly are persistent identifiers? Next slide. So persistent identifiers is they are long-lasting references to the scholarly entity. Is it like a name? Well, names are common. And yes, you can use the same name to identify two different people. However, person or a thing can also have more than a name. So what persistent identifiers actually do is they have two main attributes associated to them. First is they're persistent, obviously. So what that means is they are intended to be around for a very long time. Secondly, they are unique. So persistent identifier is a unique identifier that provides information on the provenance of the object it identifies. It describes that object with metadata and who has created it or how it was created. And then the organization that registers the persistent identifier can share that information about the policies and practices which fosters trust in the identifier itself. Next slide, please. So these are some of the persistent identifiers that we have in the Australian landscape at the moment. We're looking at ORCID IDs for researchers. There's the DOI and PEARLs for grants. You have DOI for research data sets and publications. You've got RAID, which is the research activity identifier for projects. You also have ROR, which is the research organization registry, and those are organization IDs, so persistent identifiers for organizations. And you have the IGSN, which are used as PIDs for samples. Next slide. Beautiful. So ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID. It is a persistent identifier that is unique to a researcher, and it connects researchers to their research contributions. What that means is every researcher would have a unique ORCID ID, and no two researchers will have the same ORCID ID. So what that means is not just allowing to prevent name disambiguity, but it also lets researchers claim whatever contributions they've made, connect to their contributions, and even if they choose to change their discipline or organizations where they work, their research follows them wherever they go. Next slide, please. So, with the Australian ORCID Consortium, this was launched in 2016 with about 40 members. Over the years, it's gone through a number of phases where in 2018, we had the Australian Research Council announce that they would be using ORCID IDs. They would be letting researchers use their ORCID IDs to apply for grant funding. Then in 2020, we also launched a maturity assessment survey for our members to help them assess what sort of integrations they have, how their integrations are doing, and what they can, how they can leverage benefits of their ORCID integrations. In 2022, we had the Australian Research Data Commons join, and around that time, we had 91% of all our members who had integrated their systems with ORCID. 2023 was when we along with the Australian Research Data Commons commissioned a cost benefit analysis report on the implementation of PIDs within the Australian research sector. And we also had Queensland Health, which was the first health department, actually join the Australian ORCID Consortium. In 2024, as of this point, we have 44 members, of which 100% of them have connected their systems with ORCID, which is great. And we also have the Australian National PID Strategy and Roadmap published, which the ARDC have done. So next slide, please. This is in a snapshot telling you what the consortium's all about. It tells you who our members are. We've got 2 funders, 3 research organizations, 1 government organization, and 38 higher education institutes. There's a lot more detail about it that can be found on the AAF ORCID webpage. Next slide, please. So some of the benefits of being in a consortium is that it lowers the barrier to entry. It provides premium ORCID membership to members, and it reduces the cost of membership by well over 50%. So at this stage, currently, members have saved about $5.9 million in membership costs, and that's just the cost from 2016 to 2024. And the best thing is you do have in-country support available from the AAF. Next slide. Some of the benefits of having an ORCID integration, as our members told us when we did the maturity assessment survey, was that you can auto-populate forms, databases, repositories, have affiliation information entered into researchers' ORCID record. Then the highest one was report on ORCID statistics within the organization, but also use data from ORCID integration to inform business decisions, especially when the ERA exercise was being done. Next slide, please. For the Australian Research Council, based on the case study that More Brains did with them when they wrote their cost benefit analysis report, it was found that researchers generally save time between multiple grant submissions. So say, for example, if a researcher submitted their first grant application, it took them 16 days. When they went to submit a second grant application afterwards, it reduced the time from 16 to 11.2. And then with their third grant application, it further dropped down to 7.8 days. So as they kept on submitting multiple grant applications, the number of days it took to submit a grant application actually reduced. And this was because of the usage of persistent identifiers within the system and the ability to automatically populate most information which was already present rather than them having to type it up all again. The next slide, please. And this is the report that was done. It was commissioned by the Australian Research Data Commons and the Australian Access Federation. Key findings from this report was that just by implementing 5 priority PIDs, what the sector would do is save about $24 million a year. And this is just in terms of efficiencies gained. So it's not anything extra that is being done. Just by implementing it, you save about $24 million a year, which is around 38,000 days per year and saves about 35% to 40% of researchers' time, which means they have more time to actually do their research rather than spend it administration of that research. And now I'm going to hand it over. Next slide, please. Yes, now I'll hand it over to Matthias and Siobhan from the Australian Research Data Commons as they tell us a bit more about the National PID Strategy and the roadmap update. Over to you, Matthias. You're muted.
Good one. Rookie error, Matthias. How many times have I done this? Kaya, everyone from Borroloo, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging who have kept their culture alive for tens of thousands of years and continue to keep it alive. I will very quickly throw my slides up. And so I am the product manager for persistent identifier services at the ARDC. The bulk of my work is in helping Australian organisations get the most out of PIDs. And part of that is to work on the National PID Strategy. And I'm also on the RAID team. Siobhan, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Hello, folks. My name's Siobhan McCafferty. I'm part of the ARDC based here in Meanjin, Brisbane. I have multiple hats within ARDC, but the most important hat for today is the PIDs hat. So I've been part of the development of the RAID service, originally the project and now the service. And I work a lot in instrument identifiers. So you might be familiar with the work that I4IOZ has done and the work that we're doing with the PID RDA group.
Wonderful. Thank you, Siobhan. Now, I'm going to be doing the bulk of the talking for the presentation, and Siobhan will help out with any questions that I can't necessarily answer. And look, I do apologise if you have seen this slide deck before. Having a look at the list of participants, there are quite a few familiar names, but also quite a few unfamiliar names. So please bear with me. I'll try and get through these relatively rapidly and then save plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please don't forget to pop your questions in the Q&A box as we talk and we'll get to them. So the story so far. Melroy already mentioned the PID cost benefit analysis and how that led to the development of the National PID Strategy, which was officially released on the 29th of February 2024. We make the most out of every day of the year, especially the extra ones. That has now led into even more work. Wonderful. So coincidentally, and we didn't plan this at all, was that the PID strategy came out in pretty much the same week as the final report of the Australian Universities Accord. We're very happy with this because the PID strategy and the Accord aligned in quite a few places, and we know that PIDs can help in increasing the uptake of university research by making it more fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We want to demonstrate the effective use of research expertise and capability in the Australian research sector. And we want to be able to better understand Australia's research capability and capacity to address all of the issues that we're facing in this century. So Melroy has already touched on, well, not touched on, he explained in good detail what a PID is and the different PIDs that are available to describe the different entities in research. And for me, the real magic with persistent identifiers is the way that they can be related to each other. So when you create a persistent identifier for something, you can say, oh, by the way, this paper was written by that person, and it was published by this organization, and it cites this data. And by building all of those links together, that is what helps us link together different things in our ecosystem and give us a better overview of how things are related to each other and how they build upon each other. And so the vision for the strategy is to accelerate research, especially Australian research quality, efficiency, and impact through the universal use of connected persistent identifiers. And we want to achieve this vision by starting or continuing the national conversation that creates a strategy and roadmap that delivers shared value for all stakeholders. And that roadmap is collaborative and national. It's not something that we at the ARDC just throw out and say, all right, folks, here's our roadmap. Who wants to join us? We are spending a lot of time having a lot of conversations and doing a lot of work in making sure that as many organizations and people as possible have input into the roadmap and develop something that is actually actionable. And so how are we doing this? So we are building this collaborative roadmap by allowing any organization in Australia to sign up and join us in the process of developing this roadmap. We also want the roadmap to be a living thing. Can an inanimate object be a living thing? Look, we want it to change over time. We don't want our roadmap to be something we set down now and we say, okay, that's our roadmap for 5 years and we cannot deviate from it. We need to be responsive to changes in the sector. So it needs to be able to be continuously updated and founded on collaborative action for all stakeholders. It's not up to just one organization to do things. Everybody has a part to play in developing and delivering our roadmap. And look, I've already mentioned, we want to be able to change it. We want to be able to respond to changes in the ecosystem and new developments. So we want this cycle of continuous improvement. Now, the next slide, I'm very sorry, has a lot of words in a very small font. And look, we're going to share these slides with you after the session. So I won't talk to this. Slide is in here for your reference to have a deeper look at. So where are we actually at right now? So a couple of months ago, we launched a dedicated website for the PID roadmap. A dedicated section within the ARDC website. So if you head over to pidroadmap.ardc.edu.au, you can have a look at all of the relevant information about the PID roadmap as it stands right now, including the strategy and related documents. We have some stakeholder action plans, which are intended to be plans that you as stakeholders can develop for your organization. There's a standard template, some examples, and you're more than welcome to book a meeting with us at the ARDC to have a talk about how you could work on developing that stakeholder action plan. We have built and we are just about to launch 3 stakeholder action groups that are centered around building outputs, including stakeholder action plans. In the first instance, we're focusing on 3 groups: on institutions, So research institutions, universities, any organization that does research. We have another stakeholder group for NCRIS, the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy. So it's a subset of research infrastructure organizations that provide big instruments and expensive equipment and valuable equipment, should I say, to Australian researchers. And finally, we have a group for organisations that fund research in Australia. Officially, the call for membership did close a few weeks ago, but we are always happy to hear from more people who would like to take part. The institutions group will not be launching for another couple of weeks, for example, and we're working on finalising dates for the NCRIS and funders ones. We have terms of reference available on the website already, so you can have a look at those and see whether you would like to be involved. We also have a very senior level strategic advisory group that has members drawn from major Australian research funders, Universities Australia, the Australasian Research Management Society, the Department of Education, and these are, I'm being recorded, but I'll use one of Siobhan's favourite phrases. These are fancy people with fancy titles. They are senior stakeholders who have the influence and to bring the sector along in this process. And that strategic advisory group will be advising us on the process and giving us input as to how we can bring the sector along. And finally, on that website, we also do have some practical information on the priority persistent identifiers. Melroy identified some of them earlier, and the principles to follow when implementing those priority PIDs. And finally, there is a summary of recommendations that were developed by a series of working groups that were held last year that tackled problems with different kinds of persistent identifiers to identify different things. That there was a lot of work produced by those working groups, and that summary is an excellent resource. So what we're going to be adding to the roadmap soon, a few more things. We've got some aspirations around our vision for how we see the sector, or how we would like to see the sector in 2028. There will be some deeper guides on various persistent identifiers and their implementation. We'll have in 2023, alongside those working group output, we also accepted submissions from any organisation. And so we're working on a summary of those recommendations. And further down the line, we'll be adding statistics and road mapping tools, and also streamlining access to the persistent identifier services provided by the ARDC and AAF. Now, I said we've got stakeholder action groups, and they will be working on developing stakeholder action plans, but something else we'd like them to work on is capability maturity models. And what I'd like to present now are some straw person capability maturity models. These were honestly drawn on a whiteboard. And we want people to tear them down and say, no, but that won't work. We need different things. So I'll present them now as a starting point that the stakeholder action groups will further develop. So for example, as a funder, a research funder, you could start by integrating ORCID into your grant management system, recording the ORCIDs of researchers who apply for grants and are successful in achieving grants. Then once you've started doing that, your next level of maturity would be to work with that ORCID API. And you get special access to you get access to a special ORCID API as an ORCID member, don't you, Melroy? And you can use that, so you know your researchers' ORCIDs. You can query that API to pull in their publication history, which is that point that saves researchers time. And then finally, to help researchers develop their kudos, a funder could write successful grants to ORCID records and be that verified source of truth. If we say funder X gave this grant to researcher Y to do this project, absolutely fantastic. Another straw person example, but this time drawing from an instrument facility example. As an instrument facility, you might like to make your instruments more discoverable, because you've got buildings full of amazing things, and it can never hurt to have a little more discoverability of those amazing things. So step one, create some public landing pages for each of your instruments to at least put on the open web the knowledge that they exist. Then, as an instrument facility, get a ROR, a research organization registry identifier for yourself, because you use that ROR then when you assign some DOIs to your instruments. And by assigning those DOIs to your instruments, that will then let you contribute records about your instruments to national and international discovery services. Now, keeping an eye on the time, I'd like to move on to, it's an excerpt from an example stakeholder action plan. And this is the University of Australia, which is a completely fictitious organisation, and any resemblance to a real organisation is purely coincidental. And so we can see that the University of Australia might like to have their researchers associated with the institution to have an ORCID. We can start there. We'd also like to have researchers with an ORCID to have their works on their ORCID record. And finally, we would also really like University of Australia researchers with an ORCID to have their affiliation with the University of Australia listed on their ORCID record. And so to achieve those goals, there are some actions that are possible with policy, with education and outreach, and for me, very importantly, integration with institutional systems so that it's easy to do. It's all very well to say, you must do this, but the more work we can do in making things easier for researchers, the better. So moving on, talking a little more about these stakeholder action groups and what we would like them to achieve. So I mentioned we've got the funders, the institutions, and the NCRIS groups. And so over the next 6 months, starting in a few weeks, we would like these groups to develop better capability maturity models, not just the flimsy straw person examples I throw up. We would like them to develop collective action plans contributed to our national roadmap, more guidance for implementation, because yes, my job title is Product Manager Persistent Identifiers, but I don't have as deep an understanding in various research processes as you all have. Identification of potential collaborative projects to be able to advance the action plan. We don't have to work in isolation, we can work together. And finally, to get that nice crunchy data we can use to demonstrate success, we want the groups to contribute to the gathering of baseline statistics that down the line we can compare against to measure that success. So I mentioned earlier, we've received a whole bunch of EOIs already. Theoretically, EOIs have closed, but because the groups aren't starting for another couple of weeks, it's not too late to join in. So if you could email us and in fact, I'll put the email address in the chat once I finish talking. I can't talk and type at the same time, but email the ARDC at contact@aaf.edu.au and saying that you would like to join one of these three groups: funders, institutions, or NCRIS. So we have our website. I would very much like you to sign up to the ARDC newsletter, which is where you can hear more about the ongoing development of the roadmap. We have a number of communities of practice that you're very welcome to join. There is a DataCite DOI community of practice that meets sporadically. Siobhan leads the Identifiers for Instruments Australasia community of practice that is very active and meets monthly. And also some of you may be involved in the Institutional Underpinnings Network. If you'd like to know more about any of those, then email contact@ardc.edu.au. And then please participate in our action groups, or you might like to sidestep the stakeholder action group and instead start working on your own action plan for your organization. And what's very important for us is when you do develop a stakeholder action plan, consider sending it to us and sharing it with the rest of Australia. So I'll stop talking there. Thank you very much. And I think we can head over to questions now.
Oh, thanks for that, Matthias. All right, it seems like we've got a question. Do you want to tell us what the question is, Emily?
Alrighty, so we've got our first question here. So is there any plan to include publishers in the roadmap? The PIDs that we've mentioned, so such as DOIs for instruments, are easy to obtain, but uptake by publishers is essential to show how useful PIDs and their interconnections are.
I think I will tackle this question. Thank you very much. It's a very good and very important question. Publishers are critical to the success of this. Now, we do not have a specific stakeholder action group for publishers at this stage, but we do have representation from a publisher on one of the groups or somebody who works very closely with publishers. We do welcome more engagement, and every opportunity I get, to be honest, I left my library life behind quite some time ago, so I don't talk to publishers as often as I used to, but every opportunity I get, I raise the PID strategy with them.
Righty, thank you. The next question we've got coming through is, what's the future of institutional underpinnings?
I suspect that's another one for me. Thank you very much. I cannot give an official answer to that because I'm not very closely associated with the institutional underpinnings group. So my understanding is that the institutional underpinnings network will continue to exist and continue to meet to discuss common problems. And that's all the information I have at this stage.
And we've got a question in the chat. So we've put a link in there, but just sharing those action plans. So they're available on the PID roadmap website within the ARDC website. I did see that Andrew had his hand up, so I'm just going to allow him to talk so he can ask that live.
Sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh, no worries.
I tried to put it back down again and then it failed. Sorry.
I would like to talk to the question about the action plans. So no action plans have actually been developed yet. So what we have on the PID roadmap website is a template for organizations to use to develop their own action plan. And we also have 2 example action plans that were developed with a couple of stakeholders as straw person action plans. So that they are examples of what could be achieved, but they aren't necessarily the concrete plans from organizations.
Alrighty, we've got another question from Graham. Is there a sustainability plan? I think that's another one for you, Matthias.
Yes. So no, at this stage, there is no specific sustainability plan for the PID strategy and PID roadmap. I don't think I can go further into that. Beyond the sustainability will hopefully be a part of those baseline statistics we want to gather now. So we do want to be able to use those statistics, compare them to future statistics to demonstrate the sustainability of persistent identifiers and in fact how in the long term they are self-sustainable in that they save money and the resources invested are outweighed by the benefits received.
So Graham's added to that and just said it will be hard to get engagement if researchers think it won't last. That was a challenge with RDA. If you have any further comment for that. I think Mel's got his hand up.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that with regards to sustainability plans, it's all on, it would be on the persistent identifiers themselves, as in the persistent identifiers are going to be around for a long time. It's why they are persistent, and they're called persistent identifiers. So they will be, in terms of sustainability, if it is the national roadmap and strategy that we are, if it's the national strategy and roadmap that we are looking at, the national roadmap, national strategy and roadmap right now is a live plan. It is not static, and it is meant to keep progressing as and when we get engagement, and as and when there is constant uptake from the universities and the research sector itself. Now, this is not something that is going to start and go away soon. It is going to be there for a long time because research is always going to be around. And as long as research is going to be there, there's always going to be a need to measure it and look at where the impact is and how to go ahead and improve it. So I guess in terms of sustainability, yes, it would be sustainable, but how sustainable it will be, as in the degree of sustainability, is something we would need to keep looking at, and it depends on the sort of interaction and engagement we get from the sector itself. Does that kind of answer your question? Is that something similar to what you were going to say, Matthias, or do you want to add anything further?
I have nothing further to add.
Alrighty, so our next question from David is there a plan to have international initiatives? Through the RDA's National PID Strategies Working Group, maybe there are quite a few national PID strategies around at the moment.
I'd like to talk a little bit about those international national PID strategies, but then I'll hand over to Siobhan to talk about some of the international initiatives that she is involved in. So recently at the PID Fest conference, which took place just over a month ago, we were lucky enough to hear from a number of organisations from around the world that were working on PID strategies. And it turns out that Australia is kind of world leading, is leading the world. And a lot of other countries are looking to us for inspiration and maybe advice and guidance as well. So there is that collaboration at the very high level of different organisations internationally comparing notes about national PID strategies. But the different countries are unique in the way that research takes place there, how it's funded, how it's operated, how organisations are related to each other. So at this stage, it really is about comparing notes as opposed to trying to develop a meta global PID strategy. Although, who knows, maybe we will get one of those at some stage. Siobhan, would you like to talk about some of your work?
Yeah, so we don't have an international strategy, but we certainly have global domination plans. Don't get us wrong. Where that work is really happening, I would say, is at national PID strategy level. There's been a real trend towards developing actual plans in the last kind of 18 months. So we've found that as a more centralised kind of country, because we're federal, we're able to do things in a slightly more go-ahead way. Australia's leading in that direction. And the consultation process that we started was picked up as a good process to use by a few other countries who are also players within the PIDs kind of services area. Europe's not a country, but I'm going to say Europe is very ahead. And particularly we've been working with the folks in the Netherlands, folks in Germany. They have some really great services and infrastructure set up there for PIDs. The UK as well, some great infrastructure there, Australia, Canada. The United States is a different story. They're very large, but they're quite decentralized. But there is planning there for some kind of national cohesion for groups to work together. So there's no international plan, but the plans are quite similar in many ways because we've used the same consultation process. We've come off probably about a decade of looking at how these services work, where the drivers are, what levers we can pull. So, you know, we've got 2 large funders in Australia. They're great levers to pull in terms of PID uptake, as we've seen with ORCID. So the successes that we've had there are becoming international standards around that. And more to the point, the community standards and discipline standards are kind of coalescing across the board. So I can talk to the work happening in instruments, which is, you know, far from coalesced, but it's probably one of the more maturing kind of areas. So the RDA, the Research Data Alliance, has had numerous interest groups and working groups working on research hardware, instruments, also infrastructure and national PID strategies. And all of those groups are international, and they work on bringing up community engagement models to develop standards. So some of the outputs of those RDA groups, and in particular, I'm thinking of the PIDs for Instruments group there. The output there was a white paper and a schema. So the schema there, in consultation with DOI, with DataSite, meant that they developed really an international standard, and they've become the de facto international standard for how you do the schema for DOIs, for instruments, sorry. The workflows around that are still coming up from the sectors themselves, and that's where groups like I4I have been doing our work. So how do we do it here in Australasia? How do we implement an international recommendation that suits us? And that also speaks to that sustainability question. What's sustainable for one country won't be sustainable for another. So it's pretty difficult to talk about overarching international schemes because we've got that those differences across countries, sectors, and also the disciplines as well. But there's certainly a lot of goodwill and a lot of collegiate activity happening in those areas, driving us forward to a situation which I see emerging where we're going to have some international standards, some best practices. Countries may recommend those, but I don't think we'll ever be in a mandating kind of position. But funders might do that. Funders might mandate things, and that'll drive it forward again. So we'll develop a kind of maturing, hopefully a maturing playing field, which will keep leveling up until it just becomes the standard that you don't even think about. And that's my world domination plans.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from Joe. What is the reason for subparts of an organisation like an infrastructure unit having a ROR as opposed to the organisation just having it?
That is a Matthias question. Matthias is also part of the ROR community call.
Yes, thanks for dubbing me in, Siobhan. So yes, I am a member of the RAW Curation Advisory Board, and I'm brought in to provide guidance and expertise on Australian organisations. So RAW is an international collaboration between DataSite, Crossref, and the California Digital Library. And RAW has, they're trying to solve a wicked problem. It is very difficult to identify organisations that sometimes seem to be in a constant state of flux. And so I've heard this question quite a few times, or variations on the question about, well, who gets a RAW, who does not get a RAW, what's the relationship, what are the rules, and what have you. And so if you go to the RAW website, you'll see that the website says that the primary use case and for RAW is about tracking author affiliation on papers. And that, going on, only top-level organisations get RAWs. So a top-level organisation is, for example, a university, or the Australian Research Data Commons, or CSIRO. However, the raw database also contains a lot of entries for units within organizations. And that is largely a historical thing, because the raw database originally, many years ago, was the customer database for a company that provides services to the research sector. And they eventually turned that into something called GRID, and they developed that, but then eventually they handed the GRID database over to RAW to really make RAW an open and transparent identifier. Now, this does mean there's a lot of historical guff in the raw database, but what we've also found, and this is where my Australian hat comes in, is that reserving RAWs for top-level organizations doesn't always necessarily match the way in which organizations or facilities are perceived within Australia. And so there are, well, we have NCRIS, the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy, within Australia, which funds 20-something facilities or capabilities, you might like to call, across Australia. And many of them have this branding that is nationally recognised, but they aren't necessarily real legal organisations with an Australian business number or an Australian company number, and they are actually projects administered by a particular university with some collaborators. Now, when it comes to acknowledging the use of those facilities, it's tricky to say that, well, I have gone to Microscopy Australia. Sorry for the Micro AU people in the room. I've gone to Micro AU, I've used one of their instruments, and I've received, and I've got some data out of that, and I want to affiliate that data with Microscopy Australia. But wait, they are not a legal entity, and they are in fact a project that is led by the University of Sydney. Now, from that acknowledgement of this facility point of view, it's not necessarily that useful to acknowledge the University of Sydney for that data, because it's more subtle than that. The data came from Microscopy Australia, which, yes, is a project administered predominantly by the University of Sydney, but has lots of collaborators around the country. And we could talk about this for hours and hours, but I am mindful of time. So what I've been doing within RAW is trying to explain this idea of national facilities that have their own identity and their own branding, but are not necessarily that top-level organization that would normally be eligible for a RAW. And that's an ongoing issue that is being resolved as the RAW team discover that it's not quite as clear-cut as their rules make out. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Thank you. I think it may be our last question, unless another one sneaks in. So this is from Harco. I work with researchers from a number of different Australian universities who each have their own platforms for creating data management plans. One complicating issue that I've encountered encountered in trying to collate the DMPs is that there are different ID systems to tag them. Is there any feasible path to having a national or international system for DMP PIDs?
I can take this one because I have an immediate solution. There is already an international system for DMP PIDs, and that is called a data site DOI. So data site DOIs are incredibly versatile. They did start out as DOIs for data sets, but have branched out into many other things. And so when an organization mints a data site DOI, there's a really long list of resource types that are useful. There is data set, there's software, there's image, there's dissertation. But one of the particular resource type here is output management plan. And so you can already, if you are a member of the ARDC DataSite Consortium, or if you're a direct member of DataSite, you can already mint DOIs for data management plans. because data management plans are classed as an output management plan. If you'd like to talk to me more about that, then feel free to email me.
Oh,
I think that's it for questions. Oh no, we've got one more. Can DRIs be used for DMPs that are not publicly accessible?
I think Melroy's trying to say something, but his connection might be a little unstable at the moment. So I will answer this follow-up question. Yes, so a DOI can be minted for anything, things that are within that list of resource types, but those things do not need to be publicly accessible. In the same way that it's possible to mint a DOI for a sensitive data set that can only be made available through mediation and with very strict security, you can mint DOIs for things that will never be publicly available. What does need to be publicly available is information about that thing, the metadata. So when minting a datasite DOI, there are 6 minimum metadata fields: the title, the date published, the publisher, the creator. Oh, I should have this memorized. There are a couple more. So you can make information about the DMP available, the title and who created it, without making the DMP itself public. There is, unfortunately, another caveat. One other thing that every DOI requires is a public landing page. So there must be a mechanism or a way to create a unique web page for each DMP that provides information about that DMP, even if the DMP itself is not public.
Yeah, I know. Mel's jumping back on.
Welcome back, Melroy.
sorry about that. It seems that I've been having internet issues.
So Emily, I think that was it for questions, wasn't it?
I believe so.
Right. Well, everyone, thank you very much for coming to this session. I do hope you found it useful. If you've got any other questions, you do have contact details for the ARDC, which I believe is contact@ardc.edu.au. Alternatively, if you've got questions with regards to the Australian ORCID Consortium or about ORCID, you can always send them to support@aaf.edu.au. If you get confused, you can just send all your questions to any one email address and we'll pass them on to the right folks. But thank you very much for attending this session. And if you've put your details in while registering, you will get an email with the recording of this. But I'd like to thank all our participants and Matthias and Siobhan for having taken the time to be here, as well as to Emily and Kerry from the AAF for facilitating the whole thing and setting it up. So thank you all and hope to see you around soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.